Andrew Jackson, The Trail of Tears and Executive Overreach. Andrew Jackson, the seventh President of the United States, is often remembered for his image as a rugged populist and war hero. He was a man of the frontier, someone who claimed to represent the common man against entrenched elites. But beneath that legacy lies one of the most tragic and brutal chapters in American history, the forced removal of Native Americans, better known as the Trail of Tears. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a law that authorized the federal government to relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River. The act was framed as a voluntary exchange of land, but in reality, it opened the door for mass displacement and suffering. Thousands of Native Americans, including the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, were subjected to brutal forced marches. The Trail of Tears led to the deaths of an estimated 15,000 people. From exposure, starvation, and disease, families were torn apart, communities destroyed, and centuries-old cultural ties to the land were erased. Perhaps even more dangerously, Jackson used executive power in ways that challenged the very authority of the Supreme Court. When the court ruled in favor of Native American rights in Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." While the quote may be apocryphal, it symbolized Jackson's belief in presidential supremacy and a willingness to defy constitutional checks. Jackson's use of power highlights how populist rhetoric, when combined with racial ideologies and unchecked executive authority, can lead to human catastrophe. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Japanese-American internment. Franklin D. Roosevelt is often ranked among the greatest U.S. presidents. He led the country through the Great Depression and World War II, enacted the New Deal, and redefined the role of the federal government. But even FDR made decisions that undermined civil liberties in the name of national security. In the immediate aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, anti-Japanese sentiment skyrocketed in the United States. Under immense pressure from the military and public, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942. This order authorized the forced relocation and internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens. Entire families were uprooted from their homes on the West Coast and sent to internment camps in remote areas. They were given little time to sell property, pack belongings, or arrange their affairs. Most lost everything. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, and internees lived in cramped, poorly heated barracks. There was no evidence that any of these individuals posed a threat. In fact, a 1983 government report concluded that the internment had been fueled by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. J. Edgar Hoover, Surveillance and the Shadow State. J. Edgar Hoover never ran for office, but he may have been one of the most powerful and enduring figures in American political life. As the first director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, Hoover held the position from 1924 until his death in 1972, nearly 50 years. Under Hoover's leadership, the FBI evolved from a small investigative agency into a sprawling domestic intelligence apparatus. But Hoover didn't just fight crime. He actively monitored, infiltrated, and undermined social and political movements he disagreed with. Martin Luther King Jr., arguably the most iconic American leader of the 20th century, was one of Hoover's top targets. The FBI wiretapped King's phones, bugged his hotel rooms, sent anonymous blackmail letters, and tried to discredit him in the media. Hoover was able to maintain this control partly through political manipulation. He kept secret files on members of Congress, judges, and presidents. No one dared challenge him. His reign shows how intelligence agencies without oversight can transform from defenders of democracy to suppressors of dissent. Joseph McCarthy, Paranoia as Political Capital. During the height of the Cold War, fear of communism swept across America. And no one capitalized on that fear more than Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. In 1950, McCarthy claimed that the U.S. State Department was riddled with communist spies. With no real evidence, he launched a series of investigations and public hearings targeting government officials, writers, entertainers, academics, and military officers. His tactics included public shaming, vague accusations, and guilt by association. While many of his targets had no connection to communism, the damage was real. Careers were destroyed, families ruined, and the political climate chilled. Americans were terrified of being labeled un-American. This period, now known as McCarthyism, represents one of the most profound assaults on civil liberties in U.S. history. McCarthy used paranoia as a political weapon, silencing opposition and dividing the nation. It wasn't until the televised Army McCarthy hearings in 1954 that the public turned against him. When attorney Joseph Welch famously asked, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" At long last, have you left no sense of decency? McCarthy's power quickly crumbled. The Senate later censured him, but the damage had already been done. His legacy serves as a cautionary tale of how fear can be manipulated into authoritarian power, even in a democratic society. Richard Nixon, Watergate and the Crisis of Accountability. In June 1972, burglars connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. What began as a minor story grew into a constitutional crisis when it was revealed that top White House officials and Nixon himself had attempted to cover up the break-in. The Watergate scandal exposed a vast web of political espionage, dirty tricks, and abuse of executive power. Nixon's administration created an enemies list, directed illegal wiretaps, and used the CIA and IRS to intimidate opponents. Perhaps most dangerously, Nixon believed that anything the president did was legal, an idea that fundamentally challenged the rule of law. During the investigation, Nixon refused to hand over audio recordings from the Oval Office. His eventual decision to fire the special prosecutor in the Saturday Night Massacre triggered public outrage. Faced with certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974. His downfall led to major reforms, including the War Powers Act, FISA courts, and campaign finance laws. Lyndon B. Johnson, Escalation and the Credibility Gap. Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency is often remembered for the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and Great Society programs, but his role in escalating the Vietnam War and the deception surrounding it marks a darker chapter in his legacy. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where U.S. ships were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces, Johnson secured broad war-making powers from Congress without a formal declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed almost unanimously. What the American public didn't know was that the second alleged attack likely never occurred. Yet Johnson used it to justify escalating military involvement. Troop numbers surged, casualties mounted, and the war dragged on, deeply dividing the country. By 1967, protests erupted nationwide. Johnson's administration downplayed setbacks, inflated victories, and misled the press and Congress, creating what became known as the credibility gap. While not authoritarian in the classic sense, Johnson's actions highlight the danger of secrecy and manipulation in foreign policy, where executive power can drag an entire nation into prolonged conflict without full democratic oversight. George W. Bush, post-9/11 powers and the War on Terror. In the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, President George W. Bush led a shaken nation into war. But the sweeping anti-terror measures his administration enacted raised profound questions about civil liberties and executive overreach. Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, giving the federal government unprecedented surveillance powers. It allowed for warrantless wiretaps, indefinite detention, and mass collection of data on American citizens. At the same time, the administration authorized enhanced interrogation techniques, widely considered torture, at CIA black sites around the world. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on false claims of weapons of mass destruction, cost hundreds of thousands of lives and destabilized the Middle East. Critics argue that Bush and his team manipulated intelligence, ignored dissenting voices, and sidelined international law. While Bush did not dismantle democratic institutions, his administration's response to 9/11 dramatically expanded the national security state, a legacy still shaping America today.